Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, or whenever you happen to be listening to this. Welcome to the Film Realist Podcast, the film and TV podcast from a complete nobody. That is hopefully for somebody. My name is Kyle Naranya. This is episode 91 of the podcast. On this week's episode, I will be reviewing Furiosa, the prequel to the Mad Max Saga. As for every feature film review, there will be a non-spoiler section and a spoiler section of the review. Time codes for those sections will be listed in the description. And to round out the show, I will be reacting to questions of the week responses and letting you know what you can look forward to on next week's episode.
Ladies and gentlemen, start your engines.
Now, this is going to be a weird movie to talk about. It's the first prequel where I don't have really a passionate feeling about the franchise it's coming from. I really enjoyed Fury Road for what it was, and the previous films I don't have an attachment to at all. Thunderdome is hilarious. The Road Warrior's probably the best of the Mel Gibson films, and we're at an interesting point in general when it comes to blockbusters in theaters, where 2023 kind of seemed to be the mark of generic blockbusters no longer succeeding in the theater and being bombs for all intensive purposes, where if you weren't putting in an effort to make something genuine and a must-see in theaters, you typically weren't going to succeed. And not to say that films that failed or didn't gross as much as expected were in that camp. Mission Impossible's Dead Reckoning, when it was originally called Part 1, didn't succeed. There were a lot of other blockbusters that you could put in the camp of just more. And I found it really interesting that the approach to this was an expansion of a universe or world with the post-apocalyptic world of Mad Max that is quite interesting to me, focusing on a character who already really had an interesting backstory, at least what was teased in Fury Road, ironically being that what most people would agree on being the titular character of that film, even though it was obviously titled Mad Max. That's what got your butt into the theater to begin with. And while I enjoyed this film, it is difficult to recapture or capture it again, that feeling. Whereas a lot of people are critical of the Avatar films for rehashing, well, particularly the first one, rehashing a story we had seen had seen a lot before, and a lot of those archetypes are conventional characters that aren't solely original, and ultimately that film dies and lives with the visuals, which at the time in 2009 or 8, whenever it came out, was jaw-dropping and mesmerizing. That's something that Weta Digital, or Weta, I'm not sure which Weta, but whatever Weta made that film was capable of at the time. Fury Road in 2015, while a simple film in structure, lives and dies on the same things, which is the visual storytelling, the use of silence, the powerful performances given from Charlize Theron, and the investment of the cast overall to really sell the next level of this world with a blockbuster budget, while at the same time being rated R and quite a serious story about the women being held by, is it Immortan Joe or Morton Joe? I don't actually think I know what Immortan Joe, that's his name. I have the wiki up here in front of me. And so exploring the origins of a character, it's really interesting because Mad Max's story kind of evolved in front of us. So I shouldn't say rehashing, but going back and giving the origin story of Furiosa could have been a really compelling film. And ultimately, it is. I enjoyed the movie. I think Anya Taylor-Joy does a really great job of showing the evolving, chaotic nature and the, pun intended, I guess, roads to which she is willing to travel on to achieve her ultimate goal. Chris Hemsworth as one of the film's antagonists is really entertaining, particularly getting to see an aspect of him that we have not seen before. In every one of his major films, he typically is the protagonist and the hero of that story. And so getting to see a malicious, really depravity from him was quite refreshing, ironic given the desert wasteland of the film's setting. Overall, it's really difficult to discuss this film because I think it's good. It does not reach the greatness of Fury Road, and I've seen Stephen Colbert, friend of the show and frequent guest, has talked about comparing it being the least interesting. But unfortunately, I don't even know how I want to phrase this necessarily, but the established visual style and cinematography, all of the elements that made Fury Road so great, if you were looking forward to going to see this, that is your bar for entering the theater to see this film. That's what your investment is. Furiosa, being a character, as already stated, was introduced in the most recent film in this franchise. And so it is difficult to not watch this movie while thinking of Fury Road. If you've not seen Fury Road, I don't think Furiosa is going to work for you at all, where it really does lean on a lot of established elements from the fourth installment in this franchise while taking place years and years before that. Anya Taylor-Joy is a really compelling version of this character, and getting to see that character's evolution, where she comes from, the tragedy that ultimately leads to her having a robotic arm, was really gripping, and a lot of the tension that you would enjoy from a Mad Max film is still present in it. I think the structure of the film is quite uneven. One thing that I'm not necessarily going to say here, but I can more in spoilers if somebody's being really obnoxious about what classifies as a spoiler, but the first 30 minutes of this are edited very disjointedly, and unfortunately because of that, I immediately was apprehensive to if I was going to enjoy the movie. I'm not somebody who lives and dies by Fury Road being one of the greatest movies ever made. It certainly is a jaw-dropping visual masterpiece on that regard. It doesn't manage to hit all of the things that I think make for a lasting film, something that I'm going to be revisiting over and over again, where Mad Max, the titular character, says very little. Furiosa, as I've already said, is the lead of that movie, and she has ultimately the arc of the story. And the continual evolution of what the Wasteland looks like has always been interesting to me. And so going back to this world was compelling. However, unfortunately, outside of Furiosa and the new characters in this, a lot of that world already exists, which is a little disheartening given how the way that the Mad Max Wasteland has continuously evolved doesn't really help this origin story, because at the same time, we see everything else that we saw in Fury Road established already, which is annoying because I would have appreciated, and this is more of what I would have liked, and I know this is much more subjective than I probably would like to begin with, but with the whole world already being established, we just get to see Furiosa grow to become the character that she is, and in that feeling simplistic, I felt my investment was overall less than it probably would have been if it was seeing exactly how all of this got to be established, as opposed to the battle between the two main antagonists of the film. You get to see Immortan Joe, and a lot of those characters don't have anything to do. And again, I don't want to keep making these comparisons. If I have seen Fury Road probably only a couple of times, so only remembering what characters look like, that's as far as it goes for me. And outside of maybe 2 or 3 characters, everybody else in the film, and this is a negative, are there for just the mad uniqueness and originality of the aesthetic of the Fury Road Mad Max world. How it's evolved post Thunderdome and evolved to the version that we know now, it being much more familiar because this is a prequel to a version of this world we've seen already. This not 2020, but this 21st century version of the Wasteland. And I find this movie hard to talk about because it's not bad by any means. It could have been, and I was nervous, as I've said already, about the way that the film sets up its origin. But then at the same time, it's a good origin story. It manages to answer, I think, enough questions that you would have for Furiosa, while also, and again, I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of of Fury Road and what we do know about her, but her relationship and her motivation moving forward seems to be pretty much established. So she is where you would expect her to be leading into Fury Road, which is, job well done, follows in the same sort of style of origin story, similar to how Rogue One eventually ended literally where Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, or just Star Wars, would begin. And so that was really interesting. I'm looking forward to kind of watching them in tandem that way, where watching Furiosa into Mad Max Fury Road, maybe I'll have more of an appreciation for what it leads to. As an origin story, it's good. Anya Taylor-Joy, I know I've mentioned this 3 or 4 times. The progression we see her with and the personal motivation and her own will to do what she needs to do continually evolves, and becoming more and more somebody who would survive the Wasteland is interesting. And she gives a performance that does feel like a young Charlize vocally, even to some degree sounding like her by the end of the film. There are some characters in this that I found a little bit interesting and honestly quite confusing. There is somebody who I quite literally thought they were establishing as a Mad Max-esque character, and he fills that role very similarly, while at the same time helping Furiosa further develop into Furiosa, which I thought was interesting. We are given an origin to her name, which is It's Her Name, which I thought was a little weird, given where we see where she's from. It doesn't really fit in with that setting, but I can get more into that in spoilers if I remember to talk about it. It's hard. The visuals in this are cool. The continual evolution of the cinematic language of Mad Max, Geroge Miller's use of technical stunts while as integrating CGI in almost invisible ways is something that he achieved with Fury Road and manages to do here as well. There is a lot of moments of humor and levity that I think help release the tension you're feeling while watching the movie, but it being an origin story, it also to some degree still goes far. It's a by-the-numbers origin story for the most part. If there are things you are curious about, they're answered. Outside of that, I don't feel it's as interesting to revisit this world again with just getting answers to questions we had. As opposed to telling something that could have been much more shocking, it being a more standard delivery of an origin story, the timeline that were presented, or the passage of events is in chronological order. And so it's much more streamlined to follow in that way. And there's a couple fun Easter eggs that we do get to witness. I find it really difficult to talk about movies that are good. I wasn't absolutely gobsmacked by the visuals or the action. They're good. It presents some fun action sequences to remind you of why this world is compelling. It has a couple of really interesting performances from its 2 main leads. But outside of that, it's more Mad Max. It is Furiosa and Mad Max Saga. It's a prequel. That's what it is. I understand why they called it a Mad Max Saga. This is a thing that's been done since probably the Twilight films when they started using the word saga in them. But it's a movie that does a good job, but I don't think it's going to have lasting impact overall. Unfortunately, it doesn't. I'm recording this on the Sunday. It doesn't look like it had the draw that a lot of people were expecting, which is interesting that the conversation around that is being had to begin with, given the fact that Mad Max Fury Road was not hugely successful. It received a substantial amount of critical success, but Mad Max Fury Road, just typing that in really quick, in Box Office Mojo, only grossed $380 million worldwide back in 2015. It did quite well domestically, but in terms of it being this smash hit, it wasn't that. If you look at the overall box office or the production budget costs, the film cost almost $200 million, so it just barely made back its budget. It might have made a profit depending on what those numbers lie in. And so the draw for this was living off of the critical success and audience discussion post Fury Road. And unfortunately, I feel like given how it's been almost 10 years, that passion and vivre for this franchise kind of seems to have dwindled off. My theater that I saw it with on the Friday evening was not super packed. And so I'm not overly surprised by the film's lack of success. it being, I believe, R-rated, I don't actually know what it was rated here in Canada. I'm going to check that really quickly because, again, that would have an effect on the film's box office success if you are limiting it to what in Canada would be 14A. That would, or even 18A. I'm not exactly sure. I'm trying to look that up really quickly here. So it's 14A. So I believe that would be, I don't know if that's PG-13 in the United States. Let's look that up. Rating USA. It is rated... So it is rated R, interestingly enough. Oh, yeah, that is how that works here. Anyways, and so the rating probably would have affected to some degree as well its overall reception. Unlike Deadpool and Wolverine that have 20 plus years of hype and anticipation, particularly seeing Hugh Jackman in the Wolverine costume, the actual yellow and blue one. Well, there are multiple ones, but you know what I mean. And so the drive to go and see this with a rating that limits more family audiences, as well as being part of a niche franchise. The Mad Max films in general, in terms of mass popularity, they don't really exist. It's always kind of been cult classic films that real film nerds have seen, Fury Road being the most popular of them, but it's not necessarily surprising to see that that's what happened. It's a good movie, it's not a great movie, and I can kind of get more descriptive as we get into spoilers, so let's jump into spoilers now.
As a child, my world was forever changed. My mother was magnificent. And he took it all from me.
We are in full spoiler territory, so if you do not want to know anything about Mad Max Fury Road that you won't know unless you've watched the film in theaters, you can duck out now. All right, so I mentioned this in the non-spoiler section, so I'm going to mention it here. The first 30 minutes of the film, so I should start off before I say what the first 30 minutes are, that the film is broken up into chapters, which I don't really enjoy those in general. I feel like for the most part, they chop up a movie, particularly in pacing, and it always feels like a restart. There are very few films that have done that I enjoy. Inglourious Bastards maybe being the only one that really does. The irony is Zack Snyder's Justice League did it, but there was a time where that was going to be a 6-hour miniseries, and then it was a whole thing. I don't love that breaking into pieces to begin with. I mean, they are good titles, but besides that, I don't enjoy when a film does that. Mad Max, or Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, does do that. And unfortunately, it hurts the film in my eyes, particularly in the very beginning, where we get so many instances in the first 30 minutes where we are given minimal, well, there's very little explanation. We get to see the green place that I believe she talks about in Fury Road and the relationship she has with her sister and this very nice, non-apocalyptic community living amongst freshwater and the agriculture and whatnot. And they have green things and they are picking fruits. And I was curious because I assumed that was going to be some sort of metaphor about forbidden fruit, but no, they're just picking, I think they're peaches. I'm not sure. It might be apples. Who knows? I'm pretty sure it's peaches. Anyways, and then some marauder shows up and they get kidnapped and they're driving away. Like, we see the determination that Furiosa has at quite a young age, which is interesting. This is something I want to bring up. I personally wouldn't have noticed it, but Anya Taylor-Joy did mention that the fact that the actress who plays young Furiosa or younger Furiosa, she says the word AI when talking about how they were able to create the evolution of her appearance to eventually bridging the gap between her and Anya Taylor-Joy. I'm assuming she's referring to something much more similar to that of a deepfake, but I'm not sure. And quite frankly, get your AI out of my movies. And the constant fading to black and choppiness of the edit in the beginning of the film, I found quite surprising. Most of George Miller's films do not feel like the pace is this substantially busted up. It felt completely as if you were being jerked back and forth. Ironically, with the whole film obviously having a substantial amount of elements around the automotive and car industry of the Wasteland with Gasland and whatnot and all the chop shops, but it constantly felt like we were being jerked back and forth between the story. And that really bothered me because I felt like we couldn't really get an established baseline for what the experience was going to be like. If it's meant to be unnerving, I guess to some degree it worked, but I didn't particularly enjoy that. The film doesn't really start to get going until, and time frame, we're not given a substantial amount of jumps forward, or at least establishing how long time has been. If we were going to be, I mean, we do get these chapter titles. I would have preferred to some degree if it was out of chronological order to kind of help establish what key events led to Furiosa being the way that she was, and perhaps the way that the narrative is being established to some degree being out of order. We are given this history man. I can't remember specifically what. Oh no, that is his name. Literally the history man who has tattoos all over his body and is aware of all these things. And I believe he's the person giving narration over the story. It says here confirms in the Wikipedia. Yeah, he is. So the fact that it's somebody telling a story, it would have made sense for it to be more disjointed. But the reveal that he is telling the story doesn't actually happen in the film outside of the fact of me recognizing that it was this actor's voice, which was annoying. Furiosa being not really raised by Dementis was also kind of confusing. The transition between her being a captive of Dementis, Chris Hemsworth character, to Immortan Joe happened quite quickly, and she sort of becomes a ghost amongst all of the kids working in his... I don't even know. What do they call it? Starts with a C. What is this place called? What is Immortan Joe's place called? Immortan Joe, the Citadel. Oh, that word just gives me PTSD after the television series. And so the back and forth between them being the warlords, that part's fun. Immortan Joe can only really act with his eyes. I believe it's a different actor from the original films. I'm just going back to confirm this. Yes, it is a different actor. So there's been two different people who have played Immortan Joe. And, well, I mean, the Hugh Keys Byrne had passed away prior to this film's production. So that's probably why. But also, given the passage of time, that would probably also explain why it's a different actor. And Furiosa's evolution is interesting, and she's the most compelling part of the movie, which is great. It is her film, after all. But as I said in the non-spoilers, the actual character arc isn't very original, and because the film's structure, outside of visuals and it being the wasteland of Australia, I'm not actually necessarily sure they even shot in Australia. Where did you film? In Australia, it says, according to the Wikipedia. And outside of those things, as I said in the non-spoiler section of the review, it's more. It explains more of her backstory. So if you were looking, as I said, for those questions to be answered, for example, where did she come from? Well, we get that question answered. Why wasn't she able to find the place that she was able to go to? It makes sense to some degree why she tattooed the star map directions on her arm, and her losing that arm. It was pretty easy to predict that's what the payoff was going to be. It's less gruesome than I expected. Her getting her arm nearly cut off by having a car tire essentially rip it off. So if you've seen Harry Potter, her arm essentially gets nearly headless nicked just before she rips it off herself when she's chained to one of Dementis's cars. I like the back and forth relationship that she has. The ambiguity to what Dementis's undoing was interesting, it being this story. But it being a story that I'm not sure the film concretely sets up. It's the rest of the details of what we're being shown don't waver in any way. It's only the ending of the movie. It's ironic because it reminds me of when in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there's just narration for no reason to start the third act, where the narration we do get in this kind of comes out of nowhere to some degree as well. And as I said in the non-spoilers, the world of this version of the Wasteland is already established. We have the Citadel, we have Bullet Town, we have Gasoline Town. Gasoline Town, I believe, and you can write in if I'm wrong about this, but that particular world or land is in one of the other films. Now, I don't remember which one it is. I want to say it's Mad Max Road Warrior. Now, I'm not certain about that, but regardless, all of those things being established and just getting to see her first time experience with them, it's fun and plays significantly into the story. You have these warlords fighting over the different aspects or the different lands or whatever zones. It doesn't matter. And because of that, that's the majority of the conflict once she's working. Well, she's working for Immortan Joe, and then it's secretly a plan. And then she meets up with Tom Burke, who plays essentially a guy to fill in for the Mad Max role. And while he's really great in the movie, I don't really feel like he adds anything to it outside of giving Furiosa agency and wanting to help her escape. He's there to motivate Furiosa, which is fine. He introduces the black paint on her forehead, which was interesting. It's a question similarly to how Wolverine got his leather jacket in X-Men Origins Wolverine. It's not something I really felt like I needed to get answered. And outside of Furiosa and Dementis, Tom Burke is good. He's not given a whole ton to do. And Immortan Joe's group of characters are just there to be odd ducks and odd balls, some of them being similarly shaped to balls in this film. And they aren't given much to do. They're just sort of there. And because of that, I left the film feeling kind of mixed. On the degree that it's a very well-made movie. The production values are great. The action, it's more minimal in this, and that's okay, is quite gripping and exciting. A lot of the stunts are quite spectacular. I mentioned this in non-spoilers. There are moments where they are supposed to be, the characters on motorcycles are supposed to be elevating quite quickly. That's going up a mountain or driving down a broken down gate to one of the fortresses. And they leave in that people wiped out, which I only could think of things like Benny Hill at that moment, which I found quite humorous. And I like that in the film, as I mentioned in non-spoilers. It helps kind of release some of the tension. This film's not as intense as I was expecting it to be. Anya Taylor-Joy is a good young Furiosa. Chris Hemsworth is a cool, interesting character. Outside of that, it is just more of the Mad Max world. I think the score is honestly a little forgettable. I like Tom Holkenborg quite a bit, or also known as Junkie XL, but having seen a lot of his movies recently, I'm hearing many more beats or pieces of musical composition that are really familiar to other songs that he's composed or other tracks he's composed for other films, which kind of to some degree took me out when I heard them. There's a drumming element that sounded quite similar to Man of Steel or something he might have put in Justice League or Zack Snyder's Justice League. And because of that, I was focusing on that as opposed to the other things presented in the movie. So it's a good movie. It's not great. I am disappointed. I was expecting to be completely gobsmacked and wowed by this, and I just wasn't. I think it's worth seeing on the big screen. This is not a movie I think you will enjoy if you are watching it on your phone or on TV. This is certainly a big screen film. IMAX probably, if it's close enough to you. The one to me, it's not worth it sometimes. And so I didn't do that for this. I just saw it AVX style, which is close. It's kind of like an in-between. So I enjoyed the movie. I know I've said this like 3 or 4 times already. It's good. It's not great. That will do it for my Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga spoiler review. Let's jump into the outro so you can find out what the answers were from fellow listeners as well as next week's question of the week. So coming off of If, which John Krasinski said he wanted to be similar to a live-action Pixar film, that was my question. What was your favorite Pixar film? So coming in first from Dylan Pollock of Movies to Watch Before You Die. Dylan, you gave a long comment, and I appreciate this. You can comment on any of the social media posts for the question of the week, or you can email the podcast. All that info is listed in the episode description. Dylan said, favorite Pixar film is a toss-up. Could be WALL-E, Toy Story, The Incredibles, with Ratatouille, and Toy Story 3 up on a tier right below. Many more hits than misses. Okay, Dylan, that's like 4 movies. Which is it then? You know, they're all great. That's the thing about Pixar that makes it complicated. Dylan, you gave much more of a comment on the whole episode as a whole, so let's keep going with that. Completely agree on X-Men 97 animation not being the best. I also don't love the look of What If. I can't do What If. The whole episode will be an hour long. I think there's something about the fake hand-drawn animation that doesn't work for me. I agree. I don't like CGI cell animation. Also, as someone who finally saw Spectacular Spider-Man in the last couple of years, I'm sure I'm clouded by watching Spider-Man the animated series growing up, but to me, it's far better. Not saying Spectacular is bad, although. I also think the Spider-Man animated series is better than X-Men. Spider-Man the animated series is looked at through such rose-colored glasses, it drives me crazy. But to each their own, whatever interpretation of the character you love that works for you, that at the end of the day, that's all that matters. That's why these characters live so long and can be adapted in so many different ways. Scotty Cameron wrote in, how you doing, Scotty? Toy Story or The Incredibles? Again, great movies. James Strecker of Jump on the Batwagon and Watchtower Database wrote in, hard to nail down, but probably either the original Toy Story, which I had as a kid and watched on VHS all the time, so it's very special to me, or the first Incredibles because superheroes and the soundtrack is amazing. That is a great score by Michael Giacchino. Stephanie wrote in, Finding Nemo. It has found family, disability representation, excellent character growth, and not to mention the amazing score. Finding Nemo is an incredible film. I would argue most of Pixar's films are S tier. There's a few that are duds, and there's a few that are just good, not great, similar to how I've described Furiosa. Nalina Heisey wrote in, WALL-E. I get the WALL-E love, but it's just not for me. And then Jermaine Jones wrote in, Lightyear. I'm joking. It's a tie between Coco and The Incredibles, the Fantastic Four Marvel movie Marvel has yet to make. I agree. The Incredibles is amazing. For me personally, it's Inside Out, a film that manages to handle the zany comedy that Pixar is known to offer while also really telling a meaningful story about dealing with your emotions, particularly at a young age, which makes me so nervous for Inside Out 2. That's my personal favorite of the Pixar films. Now, for this week's question of the week, based on Furiosa, a Mad Max Saga, what is a movie franchise you want a prequel to? So was there a character that was so compelling that was teased or didn't have enough screen time for you that you want to know more? I've recently reviewed 2 prequels on this podcast with Furiosa, Wonka, as well as the Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Not all prequels are the same. Some of them are like the Star Wars. Some of them are like The Hobbit. So that's the question of the week. To answer the question of the week, you can comment on the social media posts. You can email the podcast directly. That's filmreelistspod@gmail.com. As for next week's episode of the podcast, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to have managing film editor Sean O'Connell on the podcast to discuss his upcoming book, Bruce Willis Celebrating the Cinematic Legacy of an Unbreakable Hollywood Icon. I have read the book and I'm looking forward to discussing it with Sean. If you loved the podcast, please give it a 5-star review on your podcast platform. Share it with your film-loving friends. Maybe a friend you see movies with frequently would enjoy the ramblings of one person, with an occasional host. My name is Connor Anya. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and I hope to see you next time.